This is Rome. Not the Rome of marble statues in museums or Latin phrases in courtrooms. This is the other Rome, the one that existed in the space between the monuments. The year is 83 CE, during the reign of Emperor Domitian, and what you're witnessing isn't an execution. It's something the Romans had perfected into an art form so precise, so psychologically calculated, that modern scholars still struggle to comprehend how a civilization capable of aqueducts and republican philosophy could systematically orchestrate this level of intimate destruction. The woman's name was Cornelia. We know this because a historian named Pliny the Younger couldn't stop thinking about what he witnessed, and 2 decades later, he wrote it down in a letter that was never meant to become public. In that letter, he describes something that Roman law called damnatio. Not just punishment, but erasure, the complete annihilation of a person's humanity before their body stopped breathing. But here's what makes your skin crawl when you read the original Latin. Pliny doesn't describe this with horror. He describes it with admiration for the system's efficiency. Cornelia had been a Vestal virgin. For 30 years, she maintained the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, the eternal fire that Romans believed kept their empire alive. She was untouchable, more politically protected than senators, wealthier than most patrician families, her person so sacred that even to accidentally brush against her in the street could be considered divine offense. She could pardon condemned prisoners with a single word. She walked through Rome preceded by lictors carrying fasces, the same symbols of power that accompanied consuls. Then someone accused her of breaking her vow of chastity. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. It didn't matter that the accusation came from a political rival of the emperor seeking favor. What mattered was that Domitian needed a spectacle. He needed to remind Rome that no one, not even the most sacred woman in the empire, existed beyond his reach. So he created a trial that was really a theatrical production, with a verdict decided before the first witness spoke. The Roman Senate gathered in the Forum Romanum on a morning so cold that breath hung visible in the air. Cornelia stood before them still wearing her white robes and sacred ribbons. At first, the presiding magistrate read the charges in a voice that carried across the cobblestones: violation of sacred vows, corruption of divine duty, crimes against the gods themselves. Then came the sentence, delivered in 3 words that made the crowd go silent: damnatio ad terram, damnation to the earth. But before that came something else. They removed her sacred ribbons first. One by one, the threads that marked her as holy were cut away while she stood motionless. Then the white robes. A senator, a man who had dined at her table, who had sought her blessing for his own daughters, stepped forward and tore the fabric from shoulder to hem. The temple priestesses, who had served alongside her for decades, turned their backs as she stood naked before the most powerful men in Rome. Pliny writes that she didn't scream. She didn't weep. She stared at a point somewhere above their heads, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely, a curse, perhaps, that would outlive them all. Then the beating began. Roman law specified exactly how this part worked. They used rods made from birchwood, flexible enough to split skin without breaking bones, thin enough to reach nerve endings under flesh. The lictors who administered the beating weren't random enforcers. They were trained specialists who understood human anatomy, who knew precisely where to strike to maximize pain while maintaining consciousness. 40 lashes across her back, 40 more across her legs. They kept her standing the entire time because the psychology of the punishment required that she remain vertical, that she not be allowed the mercy of collapse. When they finished, her back looked like raw meat left in the sun. But here's the detail that transforms this from historical brutality into something that reveals the calculated architecture of Roman terror. They made her walk, not dragged her, made her walk, on her own power, through the streets of Rome. From the Forum to the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field, a patch of ground near the Colline Gate that had been consecrated specifically for this purpose. The walk was approximately 2 miles, 2 miles of cobblestones on bare feet already shredded by the beating. 2 miles through crowds that had been gathering since dawn because everyone knew what was coming. The procession moved slowly. Guards flanked her on both sides, not to support her but to prevent her from falling, because falling would have ended the spectacle too quickly. Every 100 yards, they stopped. These pauses weren't for rest. They were stage marks, carefully planned locations where the crowd was thickest, where family members had been positioned, where the architectural acoustics would carry her ragged breathing to the maximum number of witnesses. At each stop, citizens were encouraged to throw things. Not just anything. There were unspoken rules about what was appropriate. Human waste, rotting vegetables, stones no larger than a fist, because anything bigger might cause unconsciousness. The goal was accumulation, not conclusion. The goal was to transform a sacred body into something unrecognizable while keeping the person inside conscious enough to experience every moment of her own unmaking. Pliny describes one specific moment that he couldn't forget. At the base of the Quirinal Hill, Cornelia stopped walking. Not because the guards forced a pause, but because her legs simply ceased functioning. For 15 seconds, she stood perfectly still, swaying slightly, her ruined back rising and falling with breath that sounded like tearing parchment. A child in the crowd, Pliny notes this specifically, a child no older than 7 asked his father why the lady wouldn't move. The father's response, delivered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "She's learning what happens when you forget your place." Then her legs began working again, and the procession continued. When they reached the Campus Sceleratus, the real horror began, because Romans had discovered something that would take modern psychology 2,000 years to codify, that the anticipation of death creates more profound trauma than death itself, and that if you can stretch that anticipation across hours or days, you can achieve a level of psychological destruction that transcends the physical. The chamber was already prepared. A rectangular hole in the earth, approximately 8 feet deep, 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, just large enough. Stone walls on all sides, with one crucial architectural feature. They sloped inward slightly at the top, making climbing impossible. Inside the chamber, a small wooden bed, a loaf of bread, a clay pitcher of water, a vessel of oil, and a lamp. The quantities were precisely calculated. Enough oil to keep the lamp burning for 3 days. Enough water to maintain consciousness for perhaps 5. Enough bread to ensure that starvation would be slow. They lowered Cornelia down, using ropes. Not roughly, almost gently with the care you might show valuable cargo. When she reached the bottom, they removed the ropes and she stood there looking up at the circle of sky framed by stone and faces. The chief Vestal spoke the ritual words. "If you are innocent, the gods will save you. If you are guilty, the earth will hold you." Then the priests slid a massive stone slab over the opening. It took 6 men to move it. The sound it made settling into place was like a door closing in another world. And then they buried her alive. But not with earth. That would have been too quick. They sealed the chamber and simply left. Left her in darkness broken only by the lamp. Left her with just enough resources to remain conscious while her body slowly consumed itself. The chamber's design revealed the sophistication of Roman psychological torture. The sloped walls meant she could see the impossibility of escape every time she looked up. The lamp meant she couldn't retreat into the mercy of darkness. She would see her own hands, her torn body, the stone walls closing in with hallucinatory intensity as oxygen slowly depleted. The food and water meant she would have to make impossible choices, eat and prolong the agony, or refuse and die faster while watching sustenance rot inches from her face. Archaeological evidence from similar chambers suggests acoustic properties that amplified sound. Every breath would echo. Every movement would create reverberations that transformed the chamber into an instrument of auditory torture. And here's the detail that still makes historians uncomfortable. The stone slab wasn't soundproof. Families would camp near the Campus Sceleratus for days, listening. Some brought food and made it a picnic event. Children played games in the shadow of the sealed chamber while adults strained to hear signs of life below. Pliny mentions that on the third day, someone claimed to hear singing. Whether Cornelia's voice or the wind moving through cracks in the stone, no one could say. She lasted 6 days. We know this because on the 7th day, priests broke the seal to confirm death, and they found evidence that she had moved as recently as the previous evening, scratch marks in the stone that were still bleeding. When they pulled her body out, Pliny writes that her eyes were open, one hand clutched around the empty water pitcher, the other pressed flat against the stone ceiling as if she'd died, still trying to push through to air and light. But here's what reveals the true purpose of this punishment. Domitian didn't attend the chamber ceiling. He didn't need to. The power wasn't in witnessing Cornelia's death, it was in knowing that hundreds of thousands of Romans would imagine it, would lie awake at night thinking about 6 days in absolute darkness, would modify their behavior, their speech, their thoughts, because somewhere in their minds a woman was still scratching at stone, still bleeding, still conscious enough to know she was being erased one breath at a time. This wasn't an execution. This was a broadcast system, a way of transmitting state terror directly into the private imagination of every person in Rome. And it worked. After Cornelia, the number of accusations against Vestal virgins dropped to nearly 0 for 3 generations. Not because there were no violations, but because fear had become so thoroughly internalized that the mere possibility of that chamber was enough to ensure compliance. Domitian had discovered something that modern authoritarian regimes would later rediscover. You don't need to punish everyone. You just need to punish one person so thoroughly, so publicly, so imaginatively that everyone else punishes themselves. But there's a detail in Pliny's letter that he includes almost as an afterthought, a detail so strange that scholars still debate its meaning. He writes that 3 weeks after Cornelia's execution, a crack appeared in the stone slab covering her chamber. A crack that hadn't existed before. And from that crack grew a single flower. He doesn't specify what kind, just describes it as white with red veins, like blood vessels showing through skin. The priests declared it an omen and sealed the entire area, forbidding anyone to approach. But Pliny notes that for months afterward, people would make pilgrimages to see the flower, standing at the boundary line, staring at this impossible bloom growing from a grave. Whether the flower was real or myth doesn't matter. What matters is that Romans needed to believe it was real, needed to create a counter-narrative to the horror, some evidence that the earth itself had revolted against what happened there. Because even in an empire built on calculated brutality, even in a culture that considered public torture a form of entertainment, there remained some fragment of collective conscience that couldn't fully accept what had been done in the name of sacred law. The chamber remained sealed for 127 years. When it was finally excavated during the reign of Hadrian, workers found scratch marks covering every surface of the stone walls, not random, but forming patterns, possibly words, though erosion had made them illegible. They found the lamp, still containing traces of oil that had never been lit, suggesting she chose darkness over watching her own slow disappearance. And they found something else, a small clay tablet with a single Latin word carved into it, rough and barely legible, written with what might have been a fingernail or a sliver of broken pottery. The word was video. I see. Historians still argue about what that meant. Was it a declaration that she saw through the false charges? That she saw her own coming erasure? That despite everything, she remained a witness to her own unmaking? Or was it something more haunting, a message to the future, a promise that someday someone would see what had been done in the dark? We know what Cornelia saw in those final days. We know because Pliny couldn't stop imagining it, because the image of a woman scratching words into stone while dying alone became something that Rome couldn't bury, no matter how much earth they piled on top. Her story survived not because it was exceptional. Dozens of Vestals faced similar fates, but because one historian couldn't reconcile the civilization he lived in with the brutality it required to maintain itself. And that's the question that echoes across 2,000 years. How do you build an empire on both aqueducts and atrocity? How do you create legal systems that protect property rights while codifying sexual torture? How do you worship gods of justice while burying women alive for political convenience? Rome never answered those questions. They just kept building, kept conquering, kept staging spectacles of destruction so elaborate that they became art forms, until eventually the empire collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But before it fell, before the Goths sacked the city and the eternal flame finally went out, someone carved an inscription on the sealed chamber. It's still visible today if you know where to look, worn almost smooth by time but just legible enough. Hic dolor docet. Here, pain teaches. What it teaches, the inscription doesn't say. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps we're still learning what it means to be human in the space between mercy and power, still trying to understand how thin the line is between civilization and the darkness it creates in dark places underground, where women scratch final words into stone and flowers grow from graves that should have produced only silence. Cornelia died alone, but her word survived. Video. I see. And now, so do we.